January 17, 1918. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The air tasted of coal dust and metal shavings, thick enough to coat the tongue. Inside the cavernous halls of the Bethlehem Steel Works, furnaces roared with a sound that drowned out thought itself, a primordial thunder that shook the frozen ground beneath the boots of men who had not slept in days. The night shift had just ended, but the fires never stopped. They could not stop. Not now. Not when the fate of nations hung in the balance of every ingot, every billet, every ton of steel that emerged glowing and furious from the belly of the blast furnace. Outside, in the pre-dawn darkness, railcars lined up like soldiers awaiting orders, empty and hungry, destined for ports where ships would carry their cargo across an ocean churning with U-boats and uncertainty. The smell of sulfur mixed with the bitter cold, and somewhere in the distance, a steam whistle cut through the morning like a blade. This was the sound of America at war. But it was also the sound of America unprepared. 3,000 miles to the east, Allied commanders waited. They had been promised American steel, mountains of it. Steel for guns, for shells, for ships, for tanks. Steel to win the war. But when American officers opened their ledgers in Europe, the truth was undeniable. America had no steel. Not in the quantities required. Not in the grades demanded by modern warfare. Not ready. Not stockpiled. Not even reliably producible at the scale the war required. The industrial colossus that Europe imagined did not yet exist. And then, something extraordinary happened. Something no enemy could have predicted. This is the story of how America smelted victory from the scrap heaps of a nation, and stunned the world. January 17, 1918. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The air tasted of coal dust and metal shavings, thick enough to coat the tongue. Inside the cavernous halls of the Bethlehem Steel Works, furnaces roared with a sound that drowned out thought itself, a primordial thunder that shook the frozen ground beneath the boots of men who had not slept in days. The night shift had just ended, but the fires never stopped. They could not stop. Not now. Not when the fate of nations hung in the balance of every ingot, every billet, every ton of steel that emerged glowing and furious from the belly of the blast furnace. Outside, in the pre-dawn darkness, railcars lined up like soldiers awaiting orders, empty and hungry, destined for ports where ships would carry their cargo across an ocean churning with U-boats and uncertainty. The smell of sulfur mixed with the bitter cold, and somewhere in the distance, a steam whistle cut through the morning like a blade. This was the sound of America at war. But it was also the sound of America unprepared. 3,000 miles to the east, in the muddy trenches carved into the flesh of France and Belgium, men from a dozen nations huddled against the earth, waiting for spring and the offensives it would bring. The Great War had been grinding forward for nearly 4 years, devouring men and material at a rate no one had predicted, no one had prepared for. The armies of Europe had entered the conflict with stockpiles they believed sufficient. They had been wrong. Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, all had burned through their reserves of artillery shells, rifles, machine guns, and the steel required to make them. Factories that once produced plows and railcars had been retooled into arsenals. Entire economies had been reorganized around a single purpose, feeding the insatiable appetite of industrial warfare. And still, it was not enough. By 1918, the Western Front had become a furnace of its own, consuming metal as fast as furnaces could produce it. Every shell fired, every tank rolled forward, every barbed wire fence strung across no man's land represented tons of steel torn from the earth, smelted, shaped, and sent to die in the mud. When the United States entered the war in April 1917, the Allied commanders allowed themselves a flicker of hope. American industry was vast, its potential seemingly limitless. The images that came to mind were of endless plains, towering cities, railroads stretching from coast to coast. Surely, they thought, America possessed the resources and the industrial capacity to tip the balance. Surely, the Americans would arrive with mountains of steel, forests of timber, oceans of fuel. General Philippe Pétain, commanding the battered French armies, spoke cautiously but with optimism about American reinforcements. British Minister of Munitions Winston Churchill, ever the strategist, calculated the tonnage of steel America might provide and saw in those numbers the possibility of victory. The German High Command, reading intelligence reports from across the Atlantic, felt the first stirrings of unease. If America could mobilize its industrial might, if it could translate its economic power into military strength, the outcome of the war might shift irrevocably. But there was a problem. A fundamental, staggering problem that no one in the Allied High Command fully understood until American officers began arriving in Europe and opening their ledgers, their inventories, their assessments of what the United States could actually deliver. America, for all its size and wealth, had no steel, not in the quantities required, not in the grades and types demanded by modern warfare, not ready, not stockpiled, not even reliably producible at the scale the war required. The industrial colossus that Europe imagined did not yet exist. It would have to be built, and built quickly, under the pressure of a war that would not wait. The American military, when it took honest stock of its readiness in the spring of 1917, confronted a humiliating reality. The United States Army numbered fewer than 200,000 men, many of them scattered across distant posts, equipped with outdated rifles and nearly no modern artillery. The nation possessed virtually no capacity to produce the weapons of industrial war. Machine guns, artillery pieces, tanks, aircraft, these were manufactured in laughably small numbers, if at all. The Springfield Armory and a handful of private contractors produced rifles, but not nearly enough. The United States had declared war on one of the most powerful military machines ever assembled, and it had done so with an army that would have struggled to fight a regional conflict, let alone a global one. But it was the steel shortage that cut deepest, because steel was the foundation of everything. Without steel, there could be no guns, no shells, no ships, no tanks. Without steel, the American Expeditionary Force would arrive in France armed with little more than courage and good intentions. The irony was bitter. America sat atop some of the richest iron ore deposits on the planet. The Mesabi Range in Minnesota alone contained billions of tons of high-grade hematite, or so pure it seemed placed there by Providence. The coal fields of Pennsylvania and West Virginia burned with enough energy to power the forges of the world. The infrastructure existed: railroads, ports, industrial centers. What did not exist was the capacity to transform those raw materials into the specific types of steel required by modern military technology. Armor plate for battleships required a different alloy than structural steel for buildings. Artillery barrels demanded steel of extraordinary hardness and heat resistance. Shell casings needed steel that could withstand the explosive forces of detonation without shattering prematurely. These were not simple products. They required precise control of carbon content, the addition of manganese, nickel, chromium, molybdenum. They required expertise, specialized equipment, and above all, time. Time to build the furnaces. Time to train the workers. Time to perfect the processes. Time that the war would not grant. In Washington, military planners and industrialists convened in crisis meetings that stretched late into the night. The War Department issued contracts at a pace that overwhelmed the bureaucracy. Steel companies received orders for tonnages they could not imagine fulfilling. The shipyards needed steel for merchant vessels and warships. The railroads needed steel to expand their capacity to move troops and supplies. The factories needed steel to build the machinery that would build more weapons. And the Ordnance Department needed steel for guns and ammunition in quantities that made every other demand seem trivial. A single artillery barrage on the Western Front could consume more steel in an afternoon than some American factories produced in a month. The mathematics were unforgiving. If the United States was to field an army of millions, if it was to supply not only its own forces but also bolster the depleted British and French, it needed to increase steel production by orders of magnitude. And it needed to do so immediately. The steel men of America understood the scale of the challenge, but they also understood something else: opportunity. Andrew Carnegie had sold his steel empire to J.P. Morgan in 1901, creating U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in history. Carnegie himself had retired, but his legacy and his methods had not. Carnegie had built his fortune on a simple principle: efficiency. He had embraced new technologies faster than his competitors, driven down costs relentlessly, and understood that steel production was as much a science as an art. Now, in the emergency of 1918, those lessons would be tested as never before. The steel industry did not have the luxury of waiting for new ore to be mined, new furnaces to be constructed, new supply chains to be established. It would have to find another way. It would have to improvise, innovate, and adapt. It would have to, in the words of one engineer, make steel out of thin air if necessary. The answer, when it came, was both obvious and revolutionary: scrap metal. America, in 1918, was a nation overflowing with scrap. Old railcars rusted in forgotten sidings. Obsolete machinery sat in the corners of factories. Wrought iron fences enclosed 1 million properties. Tin cans accumulated in dumps. Cast iron stoves, broken tools, discarded farm equipment, the detritus of an industrializing society littered the landscape. Individually, these items were worthless. Collectively, they represented millions of tons of recoverable metal. The challenge was not merely collecting it, which would itself require a logistical effort of staggering proportions, but transforming it. Scrap metal was not uniform. It was a chaotic mixture of iron, steel, brass, copper, and a dozen other alloys, contaminated with rust, paint, wood, and dirt, feeding it into a blast furnace designed for pure or risked producing brittle, unreliable steel. But if the process could be controlled, if the chemistry could be managed, scrap metal offered a way to bypass the bottleneck of ore mining and primary smelting. It offered a way to produce steel not in months or years, but in weeks. The metallurgists and furnace operators set to work with an urgency that bordered on desperation. They experimented with charge ratios, mixing scrap with pig iron and carefully controlled additions of carbon and alloying elements. They adjusted temperatures, modified furnace linings, and monitored the chemistry of every heat with a precision that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The electric arc furnace, a relatively new technology, proved particularly suited to melting scrap. Unlike traditional blast furnaces that required coke and iron ore, electric furnaces could melt almost anything conductive. They were flexible, fast, and capable of producing high-quality steel if operated correctly. Across the industrial heartland, electric furnaces began to multiply. Steel companies that had never used them before installed them in a matter of weeks. The hum of electric current joined the roar of blast furnaces, and the production of steel from scrap began to accelerate. But production was only half the battle. The scrap had to be found and collected. In the spring of 1918, the federal government launched what would become one of the most extensive salvage campaigns in American history. Posters appeared in every city and town, urging citizens to search their homes, their farms, their businesses for metal. Your scrap can win the war, the posters declared. School children organized collection drives, competing to see which school could gather the most metal. Farmers hauled broken plows and rusted equipment to collection points. Housewives surrendered old pots and pans. Railroads conducted inventories of unused rolling stock and sent it to the smelters. Even the military contributed, as obsolete weapons and equipment were melted down and reborn as modern artillery. The effort took on the character of a national crusade. It was tangible, immediate, something every citizen could contribute to. And it worked. Within months, the flow of scrap metal into American steel mills grew from a trickle to a torrent. The transformation was staggering. By the summer of 1918, American steel production had not only recovered but had begun to exceed pre-war levels. Mills that had struggled to meet peacetime demand were now operating at capacities their designers had never imagined. The Bethlehem Steel Works, Carnegie Steel, U.S. Steel, Republic Steel, Jones and Laughlin, all pushed their furnaces to the edge of endurance. Workers labored in shifts around the clock, 7 days a week, in conditions that tested human limits. The heat inside the mills was infernal, the noise deafening, the danger constant. Molten steel could kill in an instant, and it did, with grim regularity. But the steel poured forth, and with it, the sinews of American military power. Artillery pieces rolled off production lines. Shell casings by the millions were stamped, filled, and shipped. Steel plates for ships and tanks emerged from the rolling mills, still glowing with heat. The factories that had seemed inadequate a year earlier were now producing more than the British and French had dared hope for. The European commanders, when they began to see the results, could scarcely believe it. General John J. Pershing, commanding the American Expeditionary Force, had arrived in France in 1917 with promises that his government was not yet in a position to keep. By mid-1918, those promises were being fulfilled at a pace that stunned both ally and enemy. American artillery brigades, equipped with domestically produced guns and shells, took their place on the Western Front. The logistical tail required to sustain them, railcars, trucks, warehouses, repair facilities, materialized as if conjured from nothing. British and French officers, visiting American positions, walked among equipment yards stacked with shells and remarked that they had not seen such abundance in years. The Americans, it seemed, had not only caught up but had brought with them the full weight of their industrial capacity, and much of that capacity had been built, quite literally, from the trash heaps of America. The German intelligence apparatus, ever vigilant, struggled to make sense of what was happening. Reports filtering back from the front line spoke of American units arriving with equipment in quantities that defied the pre-war assessments of American industry. How had the United States, a nation that barely possessed a standing army, managed to arm and equip millions of men so quickly? The answer, when German analysts pieced it together, was both mundane and deeply unsettling. The Americans had not relied on traditional industrial expansion alone. They had adapted, repurposed, and mobilized resources that other nations had overlooked. They had treated the challenge of steel production not as a problem of capacity but as a problem of creativity. And in doing so, they had revealed something about the American character that would echo through the rest of the century, a willingness to break rules, to improvise, to find solutions where others saw only obstacles. The symbolic weight of scrap metal, of discarded and forgotten things reborn as instruments of war, was not lost on those who lived through it. There was something deeply American about the idea that a broken plow might become a shell casing, that a rusted fence might be transformed into armor plate. It spoke to a belief in renewal, in the possibility of transformation, in the idea that nothing was truly wasted as long as it could serve a purpose. It was the industrial embodiment of the frontier ethos, the notion that resources were there to be used, adapted, and repurposed. And it stood in stark contrast to the rigidity of the European powers, which had entered the war with fixed ideas about production, supply, and capacity. America had no such baggage. It had no centuries-old traditions of how things ought to be done. It had only the problem, and the freedom to solve it in any way that worked. By the time the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, American steel mills had produced tens of millions of tons of steel, much of it from scrap. The American Expeditionary Force, though it saw less combat than the British or French, had demonstrated the industrial might that underpinned its presence. More importantly, it had demonstrated the capacity of the United States to mobilize, to innovate, and to produce on a scale that no one, including the Americans themselves, had thought possible. The lesson was not lost on the world. Future adversaries would remember that America, when pressed, did not simply outproduce its enemies, it reimagined production itself. By mid-1918, those promises were being fulfilled at a pace that stunned both ally and enemy. American artillery brigades, equipped with domestically produced guns and shells, took their place on the Western Front. The logistical tail required to sustain them, railcars, trucks, warehouses, repair facilities, materialized as if conjured from nothing. British and French officers, visiting American positions, walked among equipment yards stacked with shells and remarked that they had not seen such abundance in years. The Americans, it seemed, had not only caught up but had brought with them the full weight of their industrial capacity, and much of that capacity had been built, quite literally, from the trash heaps of America. The German intelligence apparatus, ever vigilant, struggled to make sense of what was happening. Reports filtering back from the front line spoke of American units arriving with equipment in quantities that defied the pre-war assessments of American industry. How had the United States, a nation that barely possessed a standing army, managed to arm and equip millions of men so quickly? The answer, when German analysts pieced it together, was both mundane and deeply unsettling. The Americans had not relied on traditional industrial expansion alone. They had adapted, repurposed, and mobilized resources that other nations had overlooked. They had treated the challenge of steel production not as a problem of capacity but as a problem of creativity. And in doing so, they had revealed something about the American character that would echo through the rest of the century, a willingness to break rules, to improvise, to find solutions where others saw only obstacles. The discarded had become essential. And in that transformation, there was a truth that transcended the specifics of steel production, a truth that would define America's role in the century to come. Freedom and abundance, it turned out, were not just ideals. They were resources, as real and as powerful as iron ore and coal. The freedom to think differently, to break with tradition, to experiment and fail and try again, that was a form of wealth no ledger could measure. And the abundance that came from that freedom, the ability to turn waste into strength, scarcity into surplus, defeat into victory, that was the secret weapon no enemy could replicate. The German commanders had been stunned not because America had steel, but because America had found steel where none should have existed. They had been stunned because America had refused to accept the limits that everyone else took for granted. In the end, the story of American steel in 1918 is not really a story about metal at all. It is a story about belief. Belief that problems could be solved. Belief that resources existed even when they could not be seen. Belief that the impossible was simply the untried. The scrap metal that saved the war effort was not just iron and carbon. It was faith made tangible, the physical manifestation of a nation's refusal to be constrained by circumstances. And when the fires of those furnaces finally went dark, what remained was not just steel. It was proof that a free people, given the challenge and the opportunity, could forge their own destiny from whatever materials lay at hand. The furnaces of Bethlehem still stand, cold now, monuments to an age of industrial might. The railcars no longer queue in the darkness. The steam whistles have fallen silent. But the lesson remains, etched into the history of the 20th century like an inscription on steel. America had no steel in 1918, and yet it produced more steel than anyone thought possible. It did so not by following the rules, but by rewriting them. And in that act of creation, born of necessity and imagination, a truth was forged that would outlast any empire, any ideology, any weapon, that abundance begins not in the ground, but in the mind, and that a nation unafraid to transform itself can turn even its refuse into the instruments of freedom.